The king's coming!
God is my witness. I have forgiven those that have brought me here, and pray that my death be not laid to their charge. For I do endeavor, even to the last, to maintain the peace of my kingdom.
And now the end is near, and so I face the final curtain.
I go now from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, to everlasting peace.
I've lived a life that's full, traveled each and every highway, regrets.
Lord, let us now thy servant depart in peace according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all people.
I grew tall in spite of it all, and did it my way.
Harry and Meghan's royal wedding was an embarrassment, a total farce in fact. From the bride and her family to the ceremony itself, this wedding was not fit for royalty, and it did away with over 1,000 years of history.
1,000 years of history, you say? Well, I think the royal wedding pales in comparison to chopping off the head of Charles I by Cromwell. Let's review the Sabbatean Frankist history of the present monarchy since the beheading of Charles I. The Sabbatean movement was the largest and momentous movement in the Jewish history since the destruction of Jerusalem. This is known as one of the great Jewish heresies. The Sabbateans were responsible for preaching the following: certain elect individuals are exempt from moral law, and the Sabbateans believed that the Messianic age, the laws of the Torah were no longer valid, and all had been formerly prohibited was now permitted, or even mandatory. This included all prohibition of sexual mores and incest. Therefore, their practice, which included orgiastic sexual promiscuity rites, led the Jewish community to brand themselves as heretics. Also included in the teachings of the Sabbatean Frankists is the religious myth of nihilism. Ultimately, Frank taught his followers, and Sabbatean taught their followers, that the overthrow and destruction of society was the only thing that could save mankind. Despite the fact that they were all outwardly religious, the Sabbatean Frankists thought that the annihilation of every religion and positive system of belief was necessary so that they could have a general revolution that would sweep away the past in a single stroke, so that the world might be rebuilt. Of the revolutionary philosophy of the Frankists, Gershom Scholem wrote, "In Kabbalah and its symbols, for Frank, anarchic destruction represented all the Luciferian radiance, all the positive tones and overtones of the world and the Word." Meet Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan supposedly responsible for executing Charles I and the Stuart bloodline. Oliver Cromwell and his revolutionaries that disrupted the entire British system and traditions Who did he correspond with? In 1647, Oliver Cromwell conspires with Manasseh ben Israel, an agent, to execute English King Charles I. In return for the financial support, will advocate admission of Jews to England. This, however, is impossible while Charles is living. Charles cannot be executed without trial, adequate grounds for which at present do not exist. Therefore, advise that Charles be assassinated, but will have nothing to do with procuring an assassin, though willing to help with his escape. That is a letter to Oliver Cromwell from Manasseh ben Israel, who was a Sabbatean Frankist. In conclusion, the only royal tradition of these royals since Charles I is Sabbatean Frankist philosophy of no morality.
The mainstream media used the royal wedding as a tool with which to attack European traditions and culture, and of course, the media used the spectacle as a huge rubber stamp of approval for multiculturalism and interracial relationships.
This commentator believes the royal wedding was an embarrassment because it was an attack on European values and promotes interracial relationship, probably to the destruction of the pure white European racial profile. This fear has been around for quite a few years, and it has been taught in various cults such as Theosophy and, of course, Frankism. The fear of the elimination of the white race has been around for a long time. However, it only came upon my radar a few years back. Lathrop Stotter's The Rising Tide of Color Against the White World Supremacy, and this was written in 1920, and basically he proposed the idea that the white race was vanishing, and it would vanish through natural selection, and that the white cultures were intermarrying with black cultures, and that the race of the future would just be an admixture, or as they like to call it in Nazi Germany, mongrel race. The idea of white women marrying into a black bloodline stems all the way back to Akhenaten, 1375. As you can see, Akhenaten definitely has Negroid features. I was struck when I was at the museum in Egypt at the majestic quality of Akhenaten. And as you know, Freud theorized that Akhenaten was the template for the biblical story of Moses leading his people out of Egypt. Akhenaten was the pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. He spanned from 1353 BC to 1336 BC. This is called the Amarna period, in which Akhenaten developed a new religion that disturbed all the priests and priestesses in Egypt. He moved his palace to the Amarna area and built it up very rapidly, but he was surrounded by soldiers and military, and it's almost as if Akhenaten was stolen by some invading force, and the Egyptians felt very uncertain about what was going on. That was the feeling I got from my Egyptian guide while I visited the Cairo Museum and this beautiful statue of Akhenaten. As I said, the history of white female women marrying into a black bloodline stems all the way back from Nefertiti and Akhenaten. Akhenaten was the pharaoh and Nefertiti was his wife. And as you can see, she has very Caucasoid features. Very beautiful, however. And she is supposedly the wife of Akhenaten and the mother of Tutankhamun. As we go through here, we can see this beautiful neckline, the very, very firm jaw, and these beautiful eyes. The women were indeed very pretty back then. You see, up until the 18th and 19th century, slavery in Europe was based upon the Roman system, which was not based on racial origin or traits. It was based solely upon indebtedness, much like an indentured servant. Therefore, if you became indebted, you had to work off your debt to the person you became indebted to. And that was the basic form of slavery. It was not based on whether you're white, black, Chinese, Asian. Toward the end of the 17th or early 17th century, yes, your family was also required to work off your debt even after your death. But however, when the British abolished slavery, what they were abolishing was this indentured credit form of slavery. But they instituted only in America the African slave trade, which was a surprise to the Americans, who worked for close to 100 years to abolish this most terrible form of slavery, which was based solely on race and solely on the African slave traders. So I'm going to show you more pictures as we go through here of different people, different paintings from the era, and these are quite noble paintings. And black traders and the black Moors were well known in Europe and in Shakespeare. As you know, Othello was a black Moor. But what I'm trying to convey here is that having black blood or black traits did not render you a lower class. In fact, many of these black traders had high status. I want to just point out this book, which I will in the second half of this biography about the Jolies and the Jollies. The question arises, has there ever been a black king in the British monarchy? Some believe so. Charles II. 1500 to 1789. This is off a website, but it is accurate. The Blue Blood, Black Blood by Edmund Coffrey. During the Middle Ages, black peoples in Europe were called blue bloods. There are seen in images of this people showing a blue people known as the Renaissance crucifixion with the light of blue. And as we know, we've got the Blue Man Quartet or whatever, and the Avatar movie had everybody blue. But anyway, NASA writes that the Nubians and Iranians, which were brought to Europe in 50 BC by Caesar to fight the Germanic nations, they stayed on and in their own communities along the Rhine and the Danube. NASA states that the 17th century Europeans arrived in America who were called the Black Dutch. And I will go on to elucidate that, because that was my family. We weren't Dutch at the time. We were probably known as the Black British, but also my stepfather was known as a Black Irishman. And it's not just because they do evil, but it is because of their bloodlines. So let's go on. I suggest we look at the Moors in European art and take it from there. The northern art of the Moors is always classical African pitch to it. It goes on, and it's true. Slavery, black slavery, limited to one race, was the invention of the Dutch East Indian Company. In fact, the United States was settled by these expatriates of a European conflict. One of the most significant was the beheading of Charles I and I am eventually going to get there. Charles I and Charles II were both known as Black Kings, and that was because they looked African. Well, my family, my father's family, tracing it to Joliffe and Jolly family, we were exiled to the United States, into Virginia, at the beheading of King Charles. My ancestor was the attendant of Charles I, and then later had to escape to America. My father's father, or my ancestor, Thomas Joliffe, aka Jolly, was called back to England when Charles II was restored to his rightful place. But Charles II is known as the Black King. He was very jolly and very witty, etc. I will show you the evidence for that. But inside the draped jewel is a miniature of Queen Elizabeth Firth. Oh my God. Oh, excuse me. Oh my gosh. Is Queen Elizabeth also of Black origin or African origin? Her father's sister, Mary Tudor, was the grandmother of Mary of Scots. Mary of Scots' son, James, who married Anne of Denmark, were the grandparents of Charles II Stuart, who is known as the Black Boy. And there are many pubs named after the Black Boy or the Black King. When one looks at the portraits of Charles II Stuart, the Black Boy, one finds many which show a white man with long black hair and a mustachio. But if one persists, there are portraits that show the black skin, especially in the National Portrait Gallery sites. It shows the portraits of the black-skinned boy and his black adulthood. So, the Black Boy, mother, for instance, Henrietta Maria, was the daughter of Maria de Medici, Queen of France, the aunt of Louis XIV, the Sun King. The sister of the Black Boy was Maria Henrietta Stuart, who married a Dutch stadtholder, William II. And as we shall show you, bloodlines are very important. These black bloodlines were very important to Britain. And so they did not accept the Cromwellian Roundhead white Caucasians. So they had James II, who was a Stuart, Charles. All Stuarts are black blood. Stuart in German, I believe, means black, but not only that. King Charles II, with his black curls and his very black looking skin, on, I believe, a small portraiture. They were able to do small portraitures of actual features. Those have been preserved. All the rest have been buried. But Charles II was known as a very jovial king. He was restored to the throne after his father, Charles I, was executed. His mother called him my black son, and she was Marietta Medici. She married Charles I. She was not black, but Charles I, obviously the father of Charles II, it must be assumed and can be assumed safely, Charles I was also a black Stuart king. Charles II, 1630 to 1685, the eldest surviving son of Charles I and Henrietta Maria of France, daughter of Henry IV of France. The future Charles II was born 29th of May 1630 at St. James Place in London. He was the second child of that marriage. He replaced his elder brother, Charles James, who died shortly after birth. It was said that Charles was born in 1630 was his nickname. He was called the Black Boy by his mother, Queen Henrietta, because of his dark skin. 1649, following the political crisis of his father, Charles I was overthrown by Oliver Cromwell, oh dear, and beheaded. Charles II had to flee for his life through Scotland, making a weak and symbolic attempt at regaining the Stuart title. Fate and reality had soon drawn on him, he settled into a life of penury in France. Upon the death of Oliver Cromwell, Charles was recalled back to England by Cromwell's legatee and son, who had no interest in ruling England. Well, probably because he didn't have the backing or support anymore because of the way that they had so dastardly chopped off the head of Charles I. I know this. There were many people exiled. My family also exiled during this upheaval of the, was it really a civil war or a invasion, as most civil wars are? We have Cromwell in letters corresponding with James Frank, or Jacob Frank, who was part of the initial Illuminati and their charter and their agreements and letters to take over the country through revolution. Cromwell was a part of the Frankish Sabbatean conspiracy to overthrow all the monarchs in England in order to take over all of England and to have the banks ruled by little round-headed, pot-bellied men. That's right, little round-headed, pot-bellied men. They called them the Roundheads because that's just what they had. But here's another portrait that's showing Charles II looking much darker. And we know now white women, black men have been intermarrying to produce this most beautiful race of, or shall I say, features of the biracial offspring, since it started with Akhenaten and Nefertiti. That is a long history. Elegant, beautiful Meghan Markle, who can probably outspeak him, is out-educated, has much more education than him, etc., etc., etc. I think Meghan Markle, she is probably going to be very much in charge. Charles was known as the Black Boy of England by his subjects. He is commemorated and celebrated name of the Black Boy Inn, found in the British Isles. Charles II was a black man. Many surviving paintings falsely depict him in a so-called white man. It is a clear contradiction to what he basically looked like. And here is a lithograph of Charles II. Let me see. Anyway, it shows him with very black features and a long wig of that Louis XIV wore. Here's another picture of Charles II showing him in a dark complected with dark eyes and a dark hair. Of course, that's a wig. But this is a midway between a white rendition, of which many of the paintings show Charles II as. But in the British Museum, you will find many paintings of Charles II looking very, very African. So I think, as with much of our history, we have been misled as to the white and black racial relations. And in fact, the racial divide, I believe, has only started since Charles I was beheaded, and it was done by a very white puritanical race. So I'm going to come to my most controversial statement. And the reason why this is very close to me is that my family were royalists at the time of Charles I beheading by Cromwellian Puritan religious men. And the fact is that I have come to the belief, based on my evidence, that Charles I was indeed, just like his son, a black Moor king. And that, in fact, it's inevitable if Charles II originates from the black African bloodline, then certainly his father, Charles I, because Henrietta Marie was not a black woman. So I think they have buried this, and all the Charles I paintings, which were painted by the Dutch, remember, the Dutch painters painted him in on his glorious stallion being white. But again, I believe this is hidden history because, again, my most controversial statement is going to be, could it be that Cromwell and the Puritans were responsible for killing and assassinating a black king, and that was based solely on his race, stemming from some kind of strange prejudice that these white Puritans had, where the rest of the world did not see color. For some reason, the Cromwellian Dutch East India Company did, because the Dutch East India Company was responsible for introducing slavery based on race into the Americas. And so I leave you again with the wonderful paintings and portraits of the Africans and the bloodlines in Europe. Some paintings from the era, and these are quite noble paintings. And black traders and the black Moors were well known in Europe, and in Shakespeare, as you know, Othello was a black Moor. But what I'm trying to convey here is that having black blood or black traits did not render you a lower class. In fact, many of these black traders had high status.
Okay, I want to just point out this book, which I will, in the second half of this biography about the Jollies and the Jollies,